is Maya Cook with Youth Voices KY. Today I'm joined by Stephen George, President of Louisville Public Media, and Jonice Franklin, Program Director of WFPL. On this program, we'll be addressing the crisis of truth and believability within our information systems in the dissemination of mass media. The inability to get fact-based, contextualized information withholds education and creates echo chambers that incite factions and violence, which to a larger degree arms intolerance and injustice. So in a nutshell, this is referred to as the information crisis. So Stephen and Jonice, I'm thrilled to have you guys on with me today. And before we get started, would you please introduce yourself by telling us about your position and what brought you into your life in public media?
Sure. I'm Stephen George. I'm president of Louisville Public Media. My job is to run this magnificent organization that I have the benefit of running and have the responsibility of stewarding for this period of time. Louisville Public Media has 3 public radio stations. 89.3 WFPL is news and talk. 90.5 WUOL is classical 24/7, and 91.9 WFPK is alternative music. We also have the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting. And so my job is to see to it that we have the resources to do all the work that comes out of those entities, and to make sure that we continue to keep our focus on being a true public service organization in our community. I came to public radio. I forgot the second part of your question. I came to public radio from print and online journalism, and before my role as president here, I was executive editor, so I was running our news operations.
Well, nice to meet you, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming on with us today.
Thrilled to be here.
And Jonice, would you tell us a little bit about your position and also what brought you into this life in public media?
Sure. I'm Jonice Franklin. I'm program director for 89.3 WFPL News. As Stephen just said, the news station of our 3 stations at Louisville Public Media. My job is to manage the daily operation, the on-air presentation of WFPL, work with reporters and editors in the newsroom. I'm also an editor from time to time. So I do edit news stories from time to time. I'm a host. I host All Things Considered every day on the air, and I get to decide what the program schedule looks like. I pick the shows that air at any given time on WFPL, and my job is to make a great listening experience for people who tune into our radio station. What brought me to public radio was I started working in public radio as a freshman in college at Morehead State University at the NPR station there. I was 17. I started working in the newsroom as a reporter, quickly moved on to the air as a host, and I've worked at some other public radio stations in Kentucky, and finally landed at WFPL in 2016.
Well, it's nice to meet you, Jonice, and it's such a privilege to have you guys on with us today. And with all of your experience and work in this domain, you guys are both excellent candidates to speak on the information crisis. So I just really appreciate you being here. And just to get started, so like with public media, I think information keepers, in my opinion, have like an ethical obligation to advance the truth and empower civil discourse and free press, all while encouraging a space where communities can come together to advance solutions to different challenges. So what do you guys think are the duties or qualities of good public media?
I think you did a really nice job of describing the mission of public radio right there. And I'd say it is our mission to advance truth, to advance fairness in journalism and storytelling, to be representative and inclusive of the communities we're covering, and to seek to have a positive impact on civic engagement. So democracy requires a strong press. In particular, it requires a strong local press, and we view it as a key role of ours to give people the tools they need to make decisions about their everyday lives.
I couldn't have said that better myself. And I believe that when we do our job right, we help citizens become better citizens, more informed citizens. And I think that's the goal every day.
Yeah, that's so important, especially within local media and everything, like you're saying. But I feel like now current information systems are designed by like profiteering companies that drive the media. So with uncontextualized information, partisan bias, and advanced algorithms that like limit what information is accessible to people, would you say that these current media systems are maintaining their duty to educate and inform the public like you guys are doing?
That's a really good and complicated question. So when I look at other news organizations, say some of the big chains that own a lot of different news entities across the country, the people who work in those newsrooms, by and large, have the same set of values that we do. The problem is that they're working in a business model that does not prioritize or reward those values necessarily, right? And so, for example, if your revenue, and this is the way you pay your employees, comes primarily from online engagement, and that's sort of translated as clicks, then you're going to do everything you can to get as many clicks as you can. So that means producing more, doing things that will stand out on places like Facebook and Twitter. That sometimes conflicts with the public service mission of journalism. Not every time, but sometimes it does. So for us, because our business model is not based on that, we don't have to behave in the same way. Our business model is based on the individual value we provide to our listeners and readers. And so we keep that at the forefront of what we do. And being good at that is what makes us a successful business.
And like you're saying, I mean, with Louisville Public Media, you've created this mantle where you've maintained a consistent and clear way to inform people of the truth. So the next step would be to get people to believe this information. But you can't always control what people think. And that's, again, not the purpose of media. So how do you make fact-based information palatable to the general public?
That's an interesting question. I think, I've been thinking a lot about information crisis, knowing that we're going to have this conversation. And I was thinking seriously about what's the solution, right? Like how do you fix this issue of there's so much information out there. And as Stephen was, pointing to, big companies, corporations, they profit off of clicks, if you will. So it doesn't necessarily always matter what the information is. It's just if it reaches enough people, right? And I don't mean to be negative or a little cynical, but I think too many people do profit off of, conspiracy theories and mistruths. So I don't know that we can fix this. I think our job every day is it's just what we do every day. We tell the truth. And I think you have to put a little bit of, some of it is personal responsibility, I think, for the consumer, for people who listen to the radio and people who read the news online. There's so much information out there. I think we as citizens need to do a little bit of the work to find those sources of news that are reputable and trustworthy. And we have to prove every day in our work, which I think that we do very well, is that we are trustworthy. It's the news that we deliver every day. And that's, I think, all that we can do, I think. If that makes sense.
No, that does make sense because like both of you have explained, if it's like ultimately a business model, where you're trying to drive media somewhat as like entertainment, to get those more clicks and views, it's really difficult to actually spread like fact-based information. And again, Jonice, like you were saying, I'd agree. I think it is like to a large degree, a duty to self-educate, to have that responsibility to be like, okay, this is, obviously not the truth, and to check maybe multiple media sources. So, in that way, we can all be educated, knowledgeable, and be able to create solutions in our community. And, fact-based information is critically important right now during this global health crisis. The United States is a world leader in COVID-19 cases. And I think that, like, perhaps if our political elite and media spoke to actual science, legitimate plans, and how to protect our neighbors, then maybe we wouldn't be experiencing the isolation, joblessness, and illness that the pandemic has brought. However, because of this uncontextualized information and political rhetoric, even that has been weaponized to rally one extreme against the other, we've seen so much denialism surrounding the coronavirus. So, like with both of you, with your experience, how would you suggest that we could have improved this situation through media and through true information?
That's a question of our time. And I think, I have a friend who had some time on his hands recently, and he decided to read the entire year of the Courier Journal from 1918. Right, so he went into the archives and he read the paper, every day's paper for that year. Right, of course, this was the last pandemic, and he shared with me and a group of friends. He shared some observations recently about that experience, and one of the key ones, to me at least, was nowhere in the coverage was a political leader. There was no governor stepping up and talking about this. There was no mayor, Congress, president in the coverage that was appearing to everybody who lived in Louisville at the time. The coverage was purely focused on what was happening with the pandemic from a health perspective. And I thought that was really extraordinary because it speaks to the problems that we've been talking about today in two ways. One, it speaks to the problem of politicizing a public health crisis, which we have seen can be disastrous and deadly. And then, the other is just the way the media covers it, right? And so we are, when we look at the institutions in our society, we look to political leadership because they're the most obvious societal leaders, right? And so part of this is the willingness and ability of politicians to get out there and create and sustain a message when it comes to the pandemic. And part of it is the fact that we're asking them about it constantly, every single day, right? And so, as a thought experiment, what if we did that differently? What if we did it more like the journalists in 1918 Louisville, Kentucky did it, where we just looked at what is the case count today, and what are the medical experts in our community saying about what people should do? I think our coverage, one of the guiding kind of principles of our news coverage is add light, not heat, right? So you have a situation like this, you don't want to try to inflame it in your coverage. You want to try to give people better understanding and information. So right off the bat, when the pandemic hit Kentucky, we saw a huge surge in audience, and they were all going to our COVID coverage, and they were all going to the daily sort of what are the facts of today. They were going to those kinds of stories. And so we focused on being able to deliver that on a daily basis. What's the case count today? What does that mean? What's a positivity rate mean? All these things that people have come to rely on, and they keep coming back and back and back and back every single day to learn about it from us. And I think, just to kind of bring this full circle, our responsibility is to tell real and true stories. And also, and this is a key point coming back to your question about believability, that feature humans. It's easy to do a really stiff policy story where you haven't talked to a single other human being. But when you can invest the time to learn somebody's story and then share it with a broader group of people, you're much more likely to provide, I think, civic health that way.
And it definitely. Oh, go ahead, Jonice.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I was just gonna say that's really interesting to hear about the coverage from the previous pandemic to not include politicians, because when you say it like that, it sort of like, maybe it's obvious, but like immediately the first thing that comes into my head is that when you get a politician in front of people, even though we want to hear from the mayor, from the governor, from the president during a pandemic, and there's a huge part of me personally that feels like we owe that to the public to bring them that. But I guess any politician would have some would want to carefully craft a message, and sort of have an angle that they're trying to shed light on. So that's really interesting to me, just personally.
Yeah, it blew my mind.
That's mind blowing. It really
because
is.
because it's so antithetical to the way everything is done now. And we look to politicians for answers on so much that they can't control, right? The economy is a perfect example. A president has very little direct influence over the economy. Congress has very little direct influence over the economy, yet we judge them based on economic performance, right? Similar thing here. And so it's just a way of thinking that has evolved over time in this country, I think, that and that really permeates every aspect of our society now.
A lot of what happens when news outlets, I think if it's done well, when you allow you give time on your airwaves, like say on TV or radio, whether it's a political candidate or it's even the president. I appreciate it, and I think it's done well when that news outlet, let's say NPR, will offer analysis afterwards, right? So something that was done during the pandemic, Stephen, you might remember this, NPR was carrying former President Trump's news conferences every day. They were carrying those live. But once they weren't able to fact check, because if you remember, Trump wasn't really allowing the scientists to speak so much as just sort of relaying the information that he was giving to them. And when NPR was no longer able to offer that analysis or fact check it, they stopped providing it. They stopped covering those press briefings because they were having to spend a lot of time saying, well, what the president said was incorrect. Here's the actual facts on this. And it's a disservice to your listeners at that point if you're just putting out false information without correcting it. So it's really interesting to me to think about what if we had done this the other way, the way that the previous pandemic was done. Maybe things would be different. We'll never know, obviously, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, it certainly is interesting because, I mean, like you were saying, it is like completely, the way they did it back then is completely antithetical to like the system that we have established today. And, to that degree, it almost makes it a thought experiment. And that's why I asked that question, because we are, world leaders, we are exceptional in COVID cases. So to think of if we had done this differently, if we had shared information in, the way that we did in the past. And of course, like you're saying, we want to be able to have our leaders come forward, because most people are going to listen to them, but we also need that objectivity of science. So ultimately, it's really difficult to maintain the balance of both of those things because, everyone is also very impressionable. So you hear something from maybe a national executive, like Donald Trump, and if it's, misinformation, then, then you get science deniers, and then, we're stuck in this pandemic forever. So, I mean, the points you mentioned are all very interesting, especially since you guys, have that experience in, public media and journalism. So I appreciate your reflections on that. And on top of the coronavirus, this past year, we've witnessed a heightened demand for racial justice. And I like to think of 2020 as a year of perfect vision because it gave us the sometimes difficult and even maybe to some people uncomfortable clarity to see that racism is not a legacy, but a construct that transcends into every possible social, political, and financial infrastructure. So increasing Black and Brown representation, underscoring oppression when we see it, and reporting representative history are all touchstones of advancing racial justice. So Jonice, I know you've done some work in this, so this next question is really for you. So when it comes to public media, what are ways that we can break down racial barriers?
Well, I think it's you see a lot of the work being done right now. Stephen and I just talked about this yesterday. We just had this. We sort of talked about this a little bit. How our own industry, public radio, public media, is sort of having its own reckoning um, when it comes to racial inequity. Um, and a lot of newsrooms across a lot of public radio newsrooms, a lot of public radio stations are predominantly white, um, and it's about, I think it's not only about your coverage. We need to be fair and representative of the community in everything that we do, whether that's the people who talk on our air, the reporters in our newsroom, the people who work for our organization. We have to do the work inside and out, if that makes sense. And so Stephen can talk more about this part, but we're in the middle of doing some extensive, diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I will let Stephen talk about that. But I think that public media's role is to, I think we should always reflect what our community is. And we have a long way to go to do that. We're working on it right now, every day. And so it's not, some of it is as simple as it sounds simple, but it's not, because it's the way that things have been done in a lot of newsrooms. And I've worked in a lot of newsrooms, but it's not talking only to Black people when you're talking about Black stories. Also talk to Black doctors and Black experts and women who are experts on, don't just talk to women about women's issues, that sort of thing. It's being mindful and always making racial equity, a part of everything that you do, top of mind all the time. And I think, a lot of people want to say that 2020 was this awful year. This is what Stephen and I were talking about yesterday. But we learned so many things. It was a very hard year for a lot of people, and some people bore the brunt of that, far worse than some of us. But I think there are a lot of lessons to take from it, and I think a lot of good things are coming out of last year, and this is one of them. I think for many of us in public media, for a lot of folks in public media, it's eyes are open now.
That's exactly right. And we view it as, here's how I think about it. It is equity is a responsibility of ours and an opportunity for us. And that's absolutely the way we think about it as we look at hiring. We're going to be expanding our newsroom soon, and we have a real opportunity there and a responsibility to get more Black voices in our newsroom, to get other people of color in our newsroom in a more significant way, because that creates a richer experience for the people we serve. And because they should be at the table making decisions and making impact in ways that I can't. And if we want to, we're public media, right? We can't segment the public. We need to aspire to serve the public that that's in our place, right? And so I won't go into the details because there are many, many, many of them, but we're looking at how to change policy to be more inclusive, how to change the processes we use to plan things to be more inclusive, how to get more people at the table in budget conversations. We're doing some work around like financial literacy of the organization so that people can be included in a deeper way in that level of decision making. It's about looking at pay equity and making sure that people are getting paid what they should be getting paid for the jobs they're doing, no matter who they are. And it's about advancement, right? Making sure that you have not just a culture, but a structure that promotes professional advancement. And so those are all the ways we're looking. And then we're also talking a lot about these issues. I mean, Jonice and I talked about it yesterday. We talk about it all the time, one-on-one, but we have a very structured, systematic way of talking about diversity, equity, inclusion at Louisville Public Media that we've been doing for 2 years now. And I think it has prepared us for I think it prepared us for last summer and the unique challenges and learning that came out of the protests around Breonna Taylor's killing. And I think it has made our culture immeasurably better already. And so I'm proud of that work, but there is no endpoint to that work. It is continuous.
Yeah, that's completely true. And I mean, like you were saying, 2020, of course, was an incredibly challenging year. But that's almost why I also called it, this year of perfect vision. Like we had full clarity into, how racism affects our society, and how much racial injustice exists. And, these solutions that you guys are providing, not only just, like inclusion and everything, but Jonice, you were mentioning, like don't just have, Black people speak to Black issues, have them represented in all walks of life, have Black doctors, have, everyone come in. So I also think that lack of inclusivity, I mean, you guys may disagree with this, but like it's probably, one of the biggest reasons too for misinformation, because if you're just stuck in one echo chamber, you're only getting one perspective, but in order to have a holistic view of events, and policy considerations and everything that goes into this very complicated society that we have, we need everyone at the forefront of it. Something that I'd like to highlight is the breach of the Capitol that occurred on January 6th. In my opinion, it was not dissent. It was an insurrection that bordered on sedition, and not allowing the constitutional obligations of the Senate to be carried out was an assault on rule of law and an abdication of our nation's executive leadership. But contrary to public belief, nothing about this insurrection was organic. It was confirmed by inflammatory rhetoric that had been propagated for weeks on Parler and such. So, in your opinion, how was this insurrection not spotted on these media platforms before we could have taken preventative measures?
That's a great question, and I think it was. I think this is part of what is going to come out in the coming weeks. First of all, I agree with your characterization of it. It was an insurrection. It was a violent attempt to overthrow the democratic process. It was the first attack on our capital since 1814, and the first time, including the Civil War, that the Confederate flag ever made an appearance inside the halls of the Capitol, which is a disgrace. I think what we're going to learn as Congress and others investigate what happened is that law enforcement and political leadership missed the signs or ignored the signs. This was out there. It was heavily covered in the media, and it was being characterized in the media as a potential threat. And so I think the failure, the Capitol Police apologized formally, finally, yesterday. There's been some really good reporting about from Vanity Fair about what the Secretary of Defense and the others who worked under him were doing at the time, why it took a long time to get National Guard troops there, why they weren't more prepared. I think there was a denialism on the part of former President Trump and potentially some obstruction there. I mean, I think without question that's going to be a key aspect of the investigation. But I think to answer your question directly, I don't see it as a failure of the media. I see it as a failure of political and law enforcement leadership.
Yeah, that's definitely probably the right interpretation of it. I think, so often we look for a scapegoat. So a lot of people are going to end up blaming the media, or at least that's a lot, like within my experience, that's what I've found, like how do people not recognize this? But I also think like it also stems from this culture of like white supremacy that we saw. Like you said, the Confederate flag was the first time that it had ever entered the Capitol. So I have to agree with you guys, instead of using the media as a scapegoat, we should be investigating like how this was actually able to transcend in the first place. It definitely was a very grim day for our history, and I was very disappointed by it, and a little bit scared too to think that something like that could occur. Like you were saying, the denialism, surrounding it and this just obstructionism. It's really discouraging to me to see that the government worked that way. But hopefully in a new administration, we can start to address these things.
I want to also say I think that your point about it being led by white supremacists is an important one, and that is already predictably getting glossed over. But the Department of Justice views white supremacy as the primary terroristic threat to this nation, and this was an example of that. The America that this group and that many in the former presidential administration wanted to return us to was one of white supremacy. Not to say we are free of white supremacy, not by a long shot, but when you say something like "Make America Great Again," what are we going back to? What are we, I think that's a legitimate question. When you bring up what media's role is, I do want to clarify that I think there are parts of the media, Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, who bear responsibility for what happened at the Capitol as well. Media is not a monolith; we all know that. But I think those who were fanning those flames, those who were breathlessly reporting hour after hour that the election had been stolen or rigged or whatever, they bear some responsibility for what happened as well, and I hope they face consequences for it.
It's definitely a good point in what you're saying about like white supremacy and make America great again. Well, what are we looking back to? Something that I found when the Capitol was breached is the first thing I thought of is people are the media is labeling them as protesters, but it was a complete insurrection, and if these people were black or brown, I know that they would have been labeled as terrorists. So it's really interesting just the way that we label people. So I just found that interesting. But Jonice, do you have anything to add to this?
Well, I think it's not only are you right, I think that if the group that attacked the Capitol was largely black and brown, not only would they have been called terrorists, but I think the Capitol would have been more prepared for it. I feel like what we were seeing on television and on the internet and hearing on the radio was evidence of the idea of two Americas. We've seen police and law enforcement be more prepared for much smaller protests from black and brown people for Black Lives Matter. Stephen is not wrong. Like we knew this was a thing. We knew this was a thing in the making. But I think it's and when you talk about Maya, when you talk about some in the media like wanting to label this a protest, for some reason I think in the media, a lot of journalists, a lot of news folks don't like to call out white supremacy. It's uncomfortable for people to talk about. It's uncomfortable to talk about race. But I think we have to call it what it is. I think we have to call, when the former president would tweet something that's racist, people would call it offensive. I think you have to call it what it is. I think you have to say what he said was racist. I think you have to call misogyny. I think you have to call homophobia. And I think there are a lot of failures on that day, the attack at the Capitol, but I think it was a lot of us are not surprised that happened. It was very scary to see it play out, but this is a lot of what black and brown people have been saying for the past few years that was possible, is that white supremacy no longer has to hide under cover of night, no longer has to hide in the shadows. And I think that's what we saw play out.
Right. And it kind of goes back into our last question about racial justice, and you guys were saying just that inclusivity and representation is what's going to allow us to go forward. And again, this is not like a fight that has an end to it. We always have to check in with our own biases and check in with our own systems. But Jonice, like you were saying, like if we had more black and brown inclusivity, it almost makes you wonder if maybe then these journalists, like you were saying, wouldn't have labeled it as a protest. They would have labeled it as terrorism. Or if we had more women in leadership, maybe it wouldn't be offensive. We call it misogyny or, homophobia or xenophobia. So it all comes back to definitely like having that representation and representative history and, being able to call out like oppressive behaviors. And that is, definitely an obligation of the media. And I know that's definitely something that you guys are doing and working to do. So we've talked a lot about this information crisis. So I have two questions left for you. So first, what can students like me and the public do to keep media and journalism accountable for fact-based information?
That's an awesome question. And my 2 cents on it is this. Make good choices in your consumption. Don't devalue your consumption as it relates to the entity that you're consuming from, right? It's worth something to us and to anybody else whose link you click on, or whose station you listen to, or whose newsletter you subscribe to, that you are providing value. So think about how you want to use that, right? And use it to support organizations and entities that tell the truth.
Just to piggyback off that, again, it's important that we as consumers, as people who listen and watch and read the news, we take some responsibility, and especially if you're going to share what you're reading or what you've heard, make sure you're sharing something from a reputable news source. Do the research, and I don't think it's hard to figure out what news organizations are trustworthy. If you have a number of them saying something similar, and you have this one over here on the fringe, or these two over here on the fringe that are saying something that seems wildly sort of made up, if you will, use your best judgment. And I would love to see more smart young people become, journalists. Get into it. That's my advice. Because again, I think the internet is free. And because of that, there's so much information out there. Not all of it is true. Not all of it is even valuable. But I would encourage you to, seek out as much information as you can, but always be aware and conscious of where you're getting your news from, especially before you hit that, click that share button.
And I appreciate you mentioning that, because we're definitely seeing a lot of that, on social media platforms. Like, I know I see it a lot on Instagram. People are just resharing things. But it goes back to a conversation we had earlier. You have to it's all about like self-education. Like you're saying, it's not difficult to compare different news sources. They all, somewhat say the same thing. And like you're saying, if it's just not true, you definitely can tell when something sounds a little bit too crazy. So my second question for you guys is, how can we help create a space where people from all political, racial, and financial demographics can find solidarity in fact-based and pragmatic community solutions?
I think that space exists in its public media, and I think our role and responsibility is to welcome more people into it.
We talked a lot about recently about programming our stations, and the content that we put out there on all our platforms, for not just the people who are listening and reading now, but for people that we want to listen and read us. So I think that's part of it, is every day, like, striving to try to reach more and different people than we already do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure in reaching those different people, like you're inspiring them to like have these conversations, and just like we've been saying this whole time, like Jonice, I know you mentioned sometimes people are really uncomfortable to talk about like racism, for example, but it's so important in order for us to be able to recognize the challenges that we have in our culture. So thank you guys so much for joining me today on Youth Voices. It's so important to continue to have these conversations so that we can educate others and create awareness about this information crisis that our world lives in. The work that you guys do is so important because it showcases that it is possible to dismantle misinformation and intolerance. So I really appreciate that you guys have given us insight on the work that you guys do.